It's my pleasure to introduce Lorrae, but just before I do it, Ros flashed up a QR code for the guidelines. If you didn't get it, you can get it through the ICID's website as well. So don't panic there. So the next session is on drought, same format, 3 speakers. Lorrae is going to do the introductions. Lorrae is a professor at the Fenner School and the director of the Institute of Water Futures, and her work her extensive work is around sustainability and the role of science in society, and very useful set of subjects or background given what we're discussing today. So over to Lorrae.
Thanks, everyone. Great pleasure to be here. And as you know, this session we are talking about drought resilience. We talked about flooding in the last one, and so we're kind of flipping it around a little bit and thinking about climate variability from the other point of view. Steve, who I'll introduce in a few moments, Steve and I worked on developing a paper that's mostly written but still sitting in my to finish folder, where we really tried to interrogate the idea of drought resilience and think about what does it really mean? How would we know if we're actually achieving it? You know, what are we talking about? And ultimately, of course, when you think about drought resilience, you're taking 2 very ambiguous terms, drought and resilience. There's at least 5 common definitions of drought, and I wouldn't even dare to try and think about how many definitions of resilience there are out there. You put them together, you end up with ambiguity squared, and it can be a very challenging space to really think through in detail and in depth what we mean when we're talking about drought resilience. But fundamentally, of course, you know, at an intuitive level, we do know what it's all about. It's about preparing, anticipating, getting our house in order, thinking about what we can do, particularly in times of not drought. Think about the, what was it, 45 mils of rain we had here yesterday. Thinking about what we do throughout or continually to be preparing and anticipating dry spells as we heard a moment ago, a part of our rhythms of climate variability that we need to be ready for, that we need to expect. Again, not think of as exceptional, but think about, you know, this is going to happen, and how do we organise ourselves to be able to deal with these dry spells better and have better outcomes when they do happen. And of course, it is when and not if. So before I introduce our speakers, I'll just briefly draw your attention to the slide behind me. We are at the Institute for Water Futures running a masterclass in February where we're going to be exploring the next big dry using really innovative scenario-based techniques and engagement to bring people into thinking about this kind of anticipatory approach, how we might consider what the next big dry will look like, and how we can organise ourselves collectively and collaboratively to deal with dry spells better. So if you're interested in that, scan the QR code or come and see me or any of my colleagues after the session. So without any further rambling on my part, joining me on the panel today, we have 3 exceptional speakers who are going to give very different perspectives on drought resilience and how we might think about it, how we might approach it. At the practical end of the scale, I'm really delighted to welcome Carolyn Hall. Carolyn is the CEO of the Malone Institute and has over 20 years of experience working across agricultural and environmental sectors. Her experience in environmental consulting is focused on balancing biodiversity values with flood mitigation, and of course a lot of synergies with the previous sessions, but also in urban and rural contexts. She has expertise in planning and environmental legislation, as well as education and community consultation. So really pleased to have Carolyn giving us an overview of the kinds of practical solutions that the Malone Institute has been working on over many years. Following Carolyn, we're going to have Steve Lade. Steve is an ARC Future Fellow at the Fenner School of Environment and Society and is a research cluster co-lead for risk vulnerability and resilience at ICEDS, and researcher with us at the Institute for Water Futures. Outside of those many hats, Steve also is Commissioner and co-lead of the Safe and Just Boundaries workstream of Future Earth Australia, a member of the editorial board of Ecology and Society, and a member of the Resilience Alliance, so very well qualified to be helping us unpack these ideas of resilience. Steve's going to provide a more conceptual perspective, but also thinking about how we can understand resilience and how that understanding can open up new opportunities for how we might achieve better outcomes. Then following Steve, I'm really pleased to welcome Hannah Feldman. Hannah is an Institute for Water Futures Research Fellow at the School of Cybernetics. She's an interdisciplinary researcher, thinker and doer on environmental social science with a focus on reaching and building equitable futures for young people. So Hannah's really going to bring in, the perspective around bringing young people into the conversations, which often, we have to admit, are not friendly spaces for young people to join and participate in. But of course, they are the people who are going to be carrying forward the kinds of challenges that we're facing into the future. So Hannah's going to look at and draw our attention to the importance of engaging with young people in anticipating drought, climate change, and the strategies that we need to be using to develop better outcomes. So thank you for joining us, Carolyn, Steve, and Hannah. And I'm going to hand over now to Carolyn. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lorrae. Let's get the slides set up. Thank you. So good morning, everybody. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I think I bring a little bit of a different perspective to some of the other speakers. And to introduce that, I guess, a little bit about the Malone Institute. We're a not-for-profit. We're a research, education and advocacy organisation. But we're deep in the space of actually delivering nature-based solutions on the ground in partnership with farmers, with rural communities and with First Nations people. Really important, I guess, that idea of resilience and climate resilient landscapes and how we do that. The thinking around that is restoring the function of the landscapes, and particularly with a focus on hydrological function. If we can repair the hydrological function of our landscapes, then we can become climate resilient, and not just to drought, but also to bushfire and to flood. We like to do this at the catchment scale. Our preference is to work with communities at the subcatchment or catchment scale. And our keystone project is the Malone Rehydration Initiative, and that's just out here at Bungendore, so quite close. And I'm sure that some of you, and indeed I know some people in the audience, are very familiar with that project. And really what we're delivering, we're battling with this terminology at the moment. We call it landscape rehydration, but it's really the restoration of landscape function. And it's all about how water moves through the landscape, how water is stored in the landscape, and how water is cycled in the landscape. And we're restoring that hydrological function for the benefit of biodiversity, but also for agriculture. So we're deep in working with farmers and for farmers. Christy mentioned the social aspects of this work. We take a communities of practice approach. These are social projects. When you're working with community at the catchment scale, you're working with a variety of people, with a variety of backgrounds, with a variety of views. We need to take them all together on a learning journey. And so we use this communities of practice approach where we deliver workshops and boot camps and mentoring, so that over the course of it can be quite short periods of time, or it can be much longer periods of time. The Malone Rehydration Initiative, for example, started in 2006. People can start to share their perspectives. They can learn from one another. We can learn from them, and they can learn from us. This is a classic photo of a before and after photo at Malone Creek, and this is sort of what it's all about. This is what nature-based solutions really can deliver. Really important for us is that we recognise that over 200 years of changed land use has degraded our landscapes and the way they function. And this slide sort of sums it up in a very sharp little graphic. So some of the first explorers would have come here and they would have found, particularly in southern and southeastern Australia, these intact valley floors, these chains of ponds on valley floors that were windows on the groundwater. So you can notice from the schematic, the groundwater is quite high, high in the floodplain, and it's covered beautifully with vegetation. The introduction, not just of European agricultural practices, but clearing for all sorts of reasons, got rid of vegetation off the floodplain and started to concentrate those flows into the channels of our streams and rivers, and in fact incised our valley floors and turned, and I think it might have been Rosalind or it might have been Tony talking about turning our rivers and streams into drains to the ocean. And that's exactly what we're seeing, that water's moving really rapidly through our landscapes and shooting through them and heading to the ocean. But most importantly, what we see here in the final picture behind me is that the level of the groundwater in those floodplains that support agriculture and are so important in our food production systems has also dropped. So when we think about drought resilience, when we think about being resilient to bushfire, when we think about having a lot of vegetation in these systems to armour against the impacts of intense flooding, the degradation of the function of these landscapes has made them incredibly vulnerable. The other aspect of this is that it takes a huge event, a huge rainfall event, to get water out of the channel, out onto the floodplain, to recharge those local aquifers and to rebuild those big, fat, spongy, wet floodplains that grow more of anything. A little bit of poetic license here, because we were in drought in 2019 and then it started raining and it hasn't really stopped. But this classic greening up of these landscapes, this is what the nature-based solutions that we deliver can rebuild. This is a classic quote from one of our landholders in the Maloon Rehydration Initiative. So going back to that social side of things, this is not just about rebuilding and restoring natural landscape function, but this is about rebuilding the resilience of communities. This is about building the capacity and the understanding that landholders, farmers, and even First Nations people who may never have experienced such degradation of country before can be upskilled. They can build their own capacity to take action in the face of climate extremes. And that's really, really important. Now, I really want to show you some of the work that we've done around Australia. But before I do, I want to point out that this is not just about throwing stuff into the creek. This is a really technically rigorous approach. So this is rock and log leaky weirs in the Maloon catchment. This is further rock and log leaky weirs over at Braidwood in New South Wales. This is a contour just south of Darwin in the Northern Territory. This is a rock and log leaky weir in Queensland. Everything is bigger in Queensland. The hats included, the flows especially. This is a flow round structure in the Central Desert, sort of where 350 kilometres northwest of Alice Springs on a pastoral station here. In WA, things are a little bit different. We're not repairing valley floors. We're doing contours to hold water up in the landscape so we don't activate salt. Again, in the Central Desert, some really simple solutions. So I'll finish there, but I just want to say that we can empower our communities. We know how to do this work. We know how to do it in every single environment around Australia, and we know how to scale it. The technology is there to do this. We just need to get the regulatory barriers out of the way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Lade, and I'd like to talk to you today about an approach to assessing drought resilience that we're developing called pathway diversity. So there's a lot of investment in drought resilience at the moment, and specifically investment that explicitly uses the concept of drought resilience as well. As one example, there's the Future Drought Fund, which is a $5 billion fund, which invests $100 million every year in activities to build drought resilience. And I'm happy to see that we have a few representatives from the Future Drought Fund and its hubs here today. But given all this interest in drought resilience, how do we actually assess drought resilience? How do we know after an intervention whether drought resilience has been built or not? Vastly oversimplifying this space, to my mind, there's two broad categories of resilience assessments. The first is a capacity-focused approach that compiles statistics of resilience indicators such as financial capital, natural capital, human capital, and so on. Two examples of these are the Early Insights for More Resilient Communities dashboard and the Australian Disaster Resilience Index. So the strengths of approaches like this are that they readily incorporate the capacity of individuals to act on the system, or agency in short, and they're also relatively quantifiable and also scalable. The downside is that these indicators are indirect representations of resilience. They're embodiments of the theories we have about what affects resilience, but the actual factors that build resilience might be very different in different places. The other broad category of drought resilience assessment approaches that I'm talking about are the systems-focused approaches, which look at interactions between human and natural components of a system and derive values for tipping points at which system resilience would be lost. This particular diagram comes from a publication by Brian Walker and collaborators who looked at the Goulburn Broken catchment in Victoria. You can see they identified a bunch of different biophysical, economic, and social components of a system and how they interacted. While more context sensitive, the roles of individuals' capacities to act get lost in this system's perspective. So our proposal on pathway diversity aims to combine the strengths of the capacities-focused and the systems-focused approaches to resilience. So here we define resilience as the diversity of option pathways that can be maintained over time. More diversity means more options to respond to drought and therefore more resilience. So the starting point of this approach is to consider, skip those, is to consider the options that an actor has available to respond to drought. So this is a very actor-focused approach. Options that a farmer could have include irrigation efficiency, crop insurance, regenerative ag practices, solar panels for pumping drought-resistant crops, water trading, or any of the nature-based solutions that we've been talking about today as well. Just to list a couple of policy options, this could include integrating surface and groundwater allocations, decisions around environmental and cultural water volumes, investment in infrastructure, changing water pricing, and restricting water allocations as well, just to mention a few. But having options, so more options is definitely good, but options are not enough because an option in the short term can have long-term consequences triggered by system feedbacks. For example, reducing environmental water allocations might work in the short term to get some farmers through a period of drought, but in the long term, we know that will likely undermine the resilience of the system. So hence, we focus on pathways, sequences of options, rather than just immediate options. And that leads us to the pathway diversity approach, in which we are able to look at agency through the options available to actors. We look at systems because we look at pathways and that enables feedbacks play out. It's a measurable approach. The simplest measure is just counting the number of pathways, but there are more sophisticated measures that you can develop as well. And it's also context sensitive because the pathways that we look at and the options are of course dependent on the particular case. So that's the theory. I'm going to take you through a couple of examples where we've applied this approach. The first case we applied this to was in Sweden, which is maybe not a country that you think immediately of when you think about droughts, this country of lakes and rivers, actually, lakes and rivers everywhere. But they actually have quite a big problem in Sweden with groundwater levels in particular. And a lot of agriculture relies on groundwater. You can see here a map on the right-hand side with in red regions, parts of the country that had much below the normal groundwater levels during a big drought they had in 2017. This southern region is also the most populated and most heavily modified part of Sweden as well. I don't want to print. Yeah. So yes, we were working in this region called Västerhavet, just down in the south there, indicated by the black dot. We took a livelihoods perspective there, so we identified in this region, which is made up of a mosaic landscape with forests and farmland interspersed with small scales. Farmers in the region had 4 broad categories of forestry strategies, such as commercial forestry or conservation forestry. They had 4 agricultural strategies like meat or milk production. And we identified 5 landscape scale strategies that were in effect in the area, such as local government support for climate adaptation. In this area, we identified those options. We also assessed the ease with which actors could switch between different strategies, because that for us, in this perspective, that's a key part of resilience. You want to be able to switch between different strategies depending on the particular characteristics of the drought that you're experiencing. We also assess the extent to which different strategies can support each other. With these data, we asked the question, do actions that support farmers also support their resilience? The answer to that question generally was yes, as you would hope. That answer corresponds to the blue squares in that diagram there. But sometimes we found that the answer was no, and that's the pink squares in that diagram there. When that happens, when the actions or the incentives made it attractive for a farmer to switch into a strategy that was subject to lock-in, or it was hard to escape from compared to other strategies. And in this particular region, that was commercial forestry because of its long decision-making timescales and the relative low returns in that part of the country. So this was the first demonstration that this approach can yield some counterintuitive and policy relevant results. Some other things that we're doing. Just a few weeks ago, we took the approach out to Griffith in the Murrumbidgee irrigation area. We did a workshop with representatives from some regional community groups, from the irrigation sector, and also local, state and federal government. We're still analysing the results of that workshop, but some early results are that pathway diversity illustrated that early adaptation success was critical to setting trajectories for later on during a drought. The pathway diversity approach showed that sequencing of options and decisions mattered, and we could look at the consequences of that sequencing. It surfaced how different value orientations shape resilience. Pathway diversity helped to strengthen dialogue and surface tensions between different perspectives on what resilience means for different groups. And the participants found it useful for training, scenario exploration, and co-design. 2 other case studies that we have in progress but haven't done yet are the Campaspe region of Campaspe catchment of North Central Victoria, and also decision-making around coral reefs in the Great Barrier Reef. Both these cases are situations where we have models, pre-existing models that we can rely on to understand what the biophysical system is doing, as opposed to the previous 2 where we were eliciting all that from workshops. So that's it. I've introduced to you today the idea of pathway diversity as a way of assessing drought, of assessing resilience and drought resilience in particular. It combines some of the strengths of the more capacities-focused approaches to resilience, as well as the more systems-focused approaches. And just to define it once again, pathway diversity is greater when you have more option pathways to deal with change. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. It's a delight to be here with you today. My name's Hannah Feldman. I assume we're going to be just absolutely hammering this slide at you as many times as possible in the next several minutes. My name's Hannah Feldman. I'm a research fellow, again, with the Institute for Water Futures and also the School of Cybernetics. And most of my work is really working with how do we start to take all of the stuff that we've talked about already, droughts, flooding, rains, and so on, and bring in a diversity of voices, particularly in intergenerational voices. And that looks kind of difficult and easy depending on who you ask, but I want to go through a little bit of stuff today around really how do young people start to experience things like drought and how can we bring in their voices early. So I'm going to start this by really giving you an overview of, well, what are the differences between, particularly when I say young people, I mean Gen Z, and I'll get into how old those people are. So a little bit older than kind of those students going just into high school, kind of late high school, early uni. I want to talk a little bit about how young people in the Murray-Darling Basin are specifically experiencing disasters, what sort of voice is presented in those disasters, and us as a community of adults, well, what can we do about that? How can we start to engage these young people really meaningfully in the kind of preparedness and resilience work that we're doing? So like I said, Gen Z, this is people who are born kind of roughly between 1997 and 2012. If you'll just sort of join me in collectively clutching our Zimmer frame, this is a reasonably older generation now as compared to what we might consider as young people. They're certainly younger than, say, millennials, who often get touted as being young people. Gen Z is sort of in that late high school to early uni sort of phase at the moment. And that's who I'm really talking about when I say Gen Z. And the reason that I'm focusing on this group is because really, if we're on the precipice of kind of doing a bit of a relay or a torch handover to a next generation of leaders in this particular region, these are kind of the people who are going to move through. Jason has already kind of addressed, you know, when we're looking 30 years back and we can kind of anticipate what we were looking to for the next 30 years, that's kind of the point that we're at with this group of people. And some of the key differences between how they approach the environment particularly, but politics as well, stem a lot from the context within which they're kind of coming of age. And I want to go over just a few short quotes from this sort of era to give us a little bit of history. Now, this quote, aside from being one of the best references that really rolls off the tongue, Henderson, Sellers, and Blanc, I recommend you kind of repeat that to yourself a couple of times, is a really remarkable quote. This is from 1989. This is around the time when Australia is holding the first greenhouse gas forums. CSIRO is doing a lot of work in climate change space. And they say the awareness of the greenhouse issue is probably greater amongst the general public in Australia than in any other country in the world. And we have a pretty quick fall from grace from that moment, right? What we see in kind of the early 2000s is a really distinct shift in the way that people are talking about climate change. This is particularly in broadsheet newspapers. We go from it being greenhouse gas forums and so on, kind of factual things, events, to opinion reporting. And that kind of starts to happen around the millennium drought. Okay, so these things, as we say, drought being a social kind of exercise, these things are happening in parallel. And so as we start to shift into that drought, we're also changing the way that we're talking about it. But fast forward another sort of 15 years, this is a Schäuffler quote, most attempts by the scientific community to help the public work through the policy and regulatory difficulties surrounding modern science has continued to focus on closing informational deficits. So on the one hand, you have a broad community of people that are out and actually now talking about climate change in kind of feelings terms in policy space, and you have an education sector that is not keeping pace. Okay, really different approaches, and it is into that scene that young people start to come of age and engage with climate change, right? That's their context. They see these two very different approaches to something like drought and disaster. And we also see educational media, the sorts of things that they're consuming through TV. I don't know if people remember things like Carbon Cops or the War on Waste. These are still programs that are still going that reflect on actually, if you just tell people what to do, then they'll change their behavior. And we kind of know that that's not true. And so it's out of this that you end up seeing a very large shift over the last several decades where young people are sort of engaging with politicized, particularly environmental issues in very different ways to older counterparts. Younger people tend to be very cause oriented. They kind of don't mind who's at the table so long as we're all here for the same reason, right? Which is kind of traditionally very difficult to the way that other older generations might have engaged with citizen orientated, voting for specific parties. Obviously in Australia, that's not such a big measure, but globally voting can tell you a lot about how engaged people are. But also, handing out how to vote cards and so on. You see a lot less of this kind of engagement from young people. And so in the place that I work in the most, and I've said this a couple of times, but when I started working in water, I didn't want to work anywhere near the Murray-Darling Basin because it was too complicated. And now we are all collectively up to our eyeballs, both literally and figuratively in the Murray-Darling Basin at the moment. There's a couple of stats up there just to say that, a lot of people are in this space, and a lot of people in this particular part of the country are experiencing droughts, floods, a various kind of number of water-related crises, both social and otherwise, economic and so on too. And a bit of work, hopefully this comes out in the next couple of weeks maybe, that I've been looking at is, okay, well, if we looked at the political group of people that live in this space, what's the sort of demographic makeup? Who are the young people that live here? And so we're talking of the voter electorates, this is only over 18s. But you can see from this sort of rough graph here that we're kind of looking at an older population in the Murray-Darling Basin. And that's a problem, not necessarily for how we're acting now, but in terms of that 30 years, what are those young people going to walk into as far as the structures that have been set up for them to take over and ownership as they go through? Now, this was, people will recognize immediately this photograph. This is from the Menindee fish kill disaster. And there was some really interesting work that happened around this time about who were the people who were actually leading the narratives in this space. And pretty consistently, a limited group of elite agricultural and political sources. This is by a really fantastic paper by colleagues written up there. Very, very infrequently were non-white, non-male, and non-kind of baby boomer aged people empowered to speak. This particular study looked at a series of about 50 to 60 newspaper articles and radio articles about who was empowered to contribute to this story. And the questions that I kind of pose in this space is like, what is that doing? What is that doing for young people who are stepping into that space, who are going to be inheriting this very, very complex political and social kind of narrative that might perpetuate older ways of doing things that don't necessarily adhere to the sorts of new ways that younger people are engaging with politics, with the environment, and with one another as well. Other printing. Printing is very important in the Murray-Darling Basin. Another thing that is really critical to take out of these experiences in the basin is that we are still not only not listening to young people in regions, but we're actually just not listening to regions. And many of the approaches in post-large drought, particularly this is past the Menindee kind of phase, but also we see this in the tinderbox drought, is that many of the things that were put forward as a way of handling these social and complex issues were very urban focused. And in all of that, young people were sharing specifically that they have their own experiences of these events. They have their own ways of looking at social isolation. They worry about their families, and they don't feel particularly empowered to do anything about this. Particularly in regional areas, we see often that families will, send, where there is means, send young people to boarding school and so on, and physically as well as kind of emotionally separate them from that space. So what do you do in my last minute that's gone for 3 minutes? Really what I'm advocating for in the work that I do is to kind of look at, well, where are young people already gathering? We can kind of say, all right, young people and adults are looking at these issues very differently. Build it and they will come is probably not going to work for this group of young people. And we've seen time and time again that particularly teenagers will push back against adult-driven experience, like ways of contributing, because they feel it's tokenistic, it doesn't fit with the way they're communicating with one another, it just kind of doesn't fit. So looking at places like where are they assembling already and how can you connect with those groups of people? There's a great irony in being a youth leader is that you don't stay a young person for very long. Unless you ask, I think the UN counts a young person as up to 35. So congratulations to many people that are joining us in the room today. You're still a young person. But there's a real problem with aging out of that community, that there is a constant set of work to be done. So who are the people that can be advocates for you in youth spaces? Who can be a mentor, and how do you train those people up? young people, particularly Gen Z, are far more intersectional than any other generation. And intersectional means that they look at various forms of minorities as combining into different kinds of ways that people engage with society. So intersectionality will include things like issues of race, issues of class, issues of gender, not just issues of consultation in drought or disaster. This is a great paper, by the way, that Macbeth piece. And finally, it's really beholden on us not to assume a lack of interest or access. If you are using words like enable or empower, that still means you hold the pen, okay? That still means that you have the power to open that door. And so if you're not doing that work, there's not a lack of interest or a lack of access. This is about us doing better to engage with those groups of people. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to leave you with a quote from a wonderful student from some work that I was doing. I think she was in Tasmania. This is Lara. And she said, we shouldn't be underestimated. Children are very passionate. We're not just young and naive because we know these things. We've watched them. We'll watch them impact the rest of our lives. Children are looking to adults to make the change because we are disappointed. We're disappointed with the state of the world, and we want adults to be our voice, and we want them to be our action. It's a little bit grim, but I hope you'll join me in seeing a bit of the hope also that Lara brings to this, and a bit of an invitation from them to us this time. All right, thanks, folks.
Don't walk away, Hannah, because we will be inviting all of the panelists to come and join us out the front as we're ready to take some questions. Okay. So as before, we have questions from the floor and from online. Evelina, do we have any online at this stage?
Happy to start. So for Carolyn, there are a few questions specifically around regulatory barriers that I think you know, and just a general ask if you might expand on that a little bit.
The next.
It's actually just me on Zoom, Caroline. I mean, like, what does that mean?
Thank you for that that question, or those questions. Very important. So, in a nutshell, pretty much all the regulations across Australia that govern our works are focused on mitigating the impacts of projects that exploit the environment for money. None of the regulatory frameworks have within them the ability to deal with projects that at their core have the restoration or the repair of landscapes and the environment. And so we are effectively treated as developers. So when we go and try and do works in stream or impact on regulated parts of the system, we have many regulatory hoops to jump. We've had some regulatory reform in New South Wales. We've got a landscape rehydration planning guide that's put us on, if you're familiar with the planning regs in New South Wales, a Part 5 approval pathway, which means we go straight to the state government agencies rather than the local government. But for a lot of farmers and a lot of community groups wanting to do this work, it's very expensive, it takes a long time, it requires a lot of skill, it's a significant barrier to landscape repair.
And certainly I know there's been examples where the cost of getting the regulatory approval is triple or quadruple the cost of actually doing the work as well. So there's financial barriers very much part of that too. Questions from the floor?
Thanks all, that was really interesting. And should I get a mic or just do
Yeah,
sorry.
hold on.
Well, that's a really interesting session talk. My question to Hannah about Samaritan Basin and how you mentioned you sometimes go away to waters, or maybe they're going away to areas where they can get certain forms of formal education, which might be more urban as well. So my question is, from people that you've been working with, not only how they look to anticipate and also counter certain futures, but where as well. Is there more commitment to these regional areas? Is it sort of a different feeling? Where are those being at?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. It's a real mixed bag from what I can see. To send someone away for boarding school costs a lot of money, right? And so there's a kind of talk about intersectionality, a bit of a class element there about who's actually enabled to leave and who isn't able to come back. And as you say, there are many kind of education opportunities and so on outside of these regions that young people do really like to stay in urban areas. There's also compounding that a kind of moving or shifting landscape around what are the sorts of economic opportunities for young people in regions, and particularly looking at things like with tech advancements and tech interventions in harvesting or roofing, seasons become much shorter, and so the kind of consistent rollover of work that young people might have once relied on to come home and do is kind of also not there anymore. And so you see a bit of a compounding set of events where actually it's just a lot easier for them to stay in Dubbo or stay in Brisbane or in these kind of areas versus coming back out. In saying that, I think there's a bit of a misconception that these young people don't want to be out in the family business or kind of doing what their families have been doing for a long time. And so they're now facing, okay, well, am I actually enabled to go and do what I want to be doing, or am I sort of forced out to stay in these urban areas? And so it is a real mixed bag. Some people do have the means and the drive to come back out into the regions and hang out there for a really long time and build their own communities in those spaces too. We haven't really talked much about how young people communicate, but obviously much more online than many others. And so you can sustain communities from afar, and that's been really important for them too. But I think over the next 30 years or so, we're going to really see quite an interesting divide in who is enabled is kind of the key question for me, to go back, who's enabled to leave, and what does that dynamic really mean for those regional areas? Yeah. Thanks.
Any other questions? Yes, okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for such an engaging panel presentations. My question is also to Hannah. I was wondering if you could expand on your recommendation about working in youth context and leveraging adult leverage points, and where you see that affect work in your own research.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know if anyone else wants to get a few words in, but I'm still going to keep holding the microphone here. What I kind of mean by that is, young people are organising themselves really effectively, but sometimes don't necessarily have the political or the social capital to put some of these things into play. And so if you've got a group of young people that are already assembling, if say you're part of an organisation that wants to do youth consultation, it's not just I start yelling out into the void. You can go to the AYCC, the Australian Youth Climate Council. You can go to various, councils around, particularly the Basin, will often have a youth board. You can kind of go to these places where young people are already engaged, they're already organising, and say, hey, I've got grant funding, or I've got money, or I've got a platform. I've got an opportunity to put in a parliamentary response. Can we work together where you can leverage the power that I have and I can be a kind of signal boost for the sorts of work that you want to do? And so really it's for me not about not reinventing the wheel as far as trying to amass groups of people for consultation or for work, and instead going out and saying, hey, I've got power in my community or in it. We at a university hold a lot of academic power, we hold a lot of social capital. What would you like me to do with that? And really listening to what those groups are lacking in the kind of work that they're already doing.
There's one project that we're doing, funded under the Climate Smart Agriculture Program, and it's a First Nations water stewardship program. So how do you engage young First Nations people in a restoration economy? You go ahead and co-design a culturally appropriate water stewardship certificate program that will upskill them to not just meet their cultural obligations around caring for country and healing country, but enable them to engage in an emerging nature positive economy. So lots of different ways, but lots of listening and building new knowledge together.
Do we have time for one more question? Evelina, any more from online? We'll go to one online question. Our final.
There are quite a few right now, but I'm gonna. And it's one that's hopefully relevant for all the panelists to maybe comment on. The original question was around how we might empower communities beyond project cycle funding. But I wonder if there's a way to expand that a bit more broadly to bring in those elements of intersectionality and leverage points in working with those boundary spanning organizations or those other actors or players, I suppose, on the margins, and how working with diverse groups of people, maybe also in the context of those diverse pathways and working with different kinds of farmers, maybe challenges how communication happens and also how it intensifies their ongoing commitment, community leadership for educative action that's being taken.
Quite a question. I'm going to throw that to Steve first. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that question. The overall message from Pathway Diversity is that diversity is important for resilience. And diversity can sometimes be at the cost of short-term efficiency as well. It costs money to build diversity, and you don't always see the benefits from that in the short term. What that diversity is, I think, is the other two could speak to more, and is also quite context specific. Sometimes that means involving diverse groups. Also means having a diversity of options to respond to change. Yeah, those are some of the ways in which diversity is useful.
I can just speak from our experience. We use a communities of practice model that I mentioned in the presentation. And when we think about beyond project funding, it's really around bringing that community together and building their capacity, upskilling them to take action, and actually us as often the project funder or the project initiator over time withdrawing and let that community of practice take their activities forward.
To wrap that up, I mean, I think diversity and engaging with diverse actors is actually a skill that we all need to build, right? This is not something that is innate in every human being, that you can work with a really diverse group of people, but there are folks who do this really, really well. And so again, connecting in with groups of people who are already doing this work. You know, Maloon is doing an amazing job in this space. There are some incredible researchers at this university who talk about how to do this better, and really being kind of reflective and going, am I actually learning something new here by working with new people? And the answer is usually yes, both on, you know, the input that you get from that community and also the skill set that it takes to really handle, you know, juggle all of these diverse perspectives. And whether it be with young people or a number of other intersectional issues, I think it's really important that all of us keep reflecting on, like, hey, we need to build this skill together. And we need to keep reflecting on our own abilities to do that. And through that experience, that's where some of the pathway diversity stuff really gets to shine. And I'm excited to keep doing that, you know? Yeah.
All right. Well, I believe that we've got no more time for questions. Thank you, everyone, for your good thoughts, thoughtful questions, and also people online. Really great to see how you're engaging with it. And of course, if you want to engage with us further on the topic of drought resilience, click on the QR code on the screen, nice because we do have our masterclass coming up, which we're all very excited about as a really exploratory and innovative way to engage with these really complex issues, and to do that collaboratively with a focus on, you know, sharing the learning amongst everybody. With that, please join me in thanking all of our panelists.